Welcome back to Inside Criminology. I'm your host, and today we're examining Chapter 4 of Larry J. Siegel's Criminology, where reason meets rebellion. Can crime be prevented if punishment is swift and certain? Are offenders truly rational in their choices? Join me as we explore the roots of rational choice theory, its policy implications, and the strategies designed to stop crime before it starts. All right, let's jump right into this deep dive. We're pulling insights directly from Chapter 4 of Larry J. Siegel's Criminology, which really unpacks what's known as rational choice theory.
That's right.
Our mission is to figure out the core ideas here,
Mm-hmm.
where this theory came from, how it views criminal decision-making, whether crime is actually rational in the real world, and how these ideas have shaped the way we try to control crime.
And the central idea, the fundamental premise this theory starts with is that people choose crime. They make this choice after weighing the potential benefits against the potential costs. The key lever for preventing crime from this perspective is punishment. But not just any punishment. It needs to be certain, severe, and swift. Those three things.
Make the consequences bad enough and happen fast enough, and people won't risk it. It sounds simple, almost intuitive, but where did this line of thinking originate in criminology?
We have to go way back, actually, to the classical school of criminology in the 18th century. Two figures really stand out here: Cesare Beccaria, an Italian social thinker, and Jeremy Bentham, a British philosopher.
The foundational thinkers for this whole approach. What were they arguing back then?
Well, their core belief was that all behavior, including deciding to break the law, is a matter of choice. Free will, essentially.
Right.
And importantly, they argued that these choices could be controlled by instilling a fear of punishment. The more certain, severe, and swift that punishment, the greater its power to deter. That was the logic.
Beccaria's on Crimes and Punishments from, 1764, and Bentham's Moral Calculus are cited as crucial works. What did Beccaria specifically emphasize?
Beccaria was big on fair and certain punishment. He had a utilitarian viewpoint, seeing the fear of punishment as necessary to motivate obedience and suppress that inherent, quote-unquote, despotic spirit he believed was in everyone.
Okay, so not revenge, but prevention.
Exactly. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about preventing future crime by making the cost clear and predictable.
And Bentham took that utilitarianism further, focusing on balancing pleasure and pain, like a scale.
Yes, precisely. For Bentham, human actions are driven by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. He believed the law's purpose was to maximize the overall happiness of the community.
Makes sense.
So punishment was something negative, and evil itself only justified if it prevented an even greater evil. He even thought about the goals of punishment in really practical terms, like preventing any offense if possible, or encouraging less serious crimes if prevention fails, using minimum force and doing it all as cheaply as possible. Very pragmatic.
That focus on efficiency and cost is striking. It brings a very practical, almost economic logic to how we should think about punishment, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And Beccaria introduced a related practical idea: marginal deterrence.
Marginal deterrence, what's that?
The classic example is if crimes like robbery, rape, and murder all carry the death penalty. Well, an offender who has committed robbery or rape has no rational disincentive not to kill any witnesses.
Right, because the punishment can't get any worse.
Exactly. So there's no marginal deterrent effect for the more serious act. Punishments need to be scaled proportionally to discourage escalating the crime.
So these classical ideas laid the groundwork, but they weren't always mainstream. Criminology shifted toward positivism for a while, focusing more on social and psychological factors, rehabilitation.
Right. That dominated for a long time. But the classical approach saw a big comeback starting in the mid-1970s.
Why then?
Well, it was fueled partly by a growing skepticism about the effectiveness of rehabilitation programs. Think Robert Martinson's famous What Works study, which basically suggested they didn't do much to prevent repeat offending. A bit controversial, but influential.
And works like Murray and Cox's Beyond Probation even argued punishment was more effective.
Exactly. That kind of research paved the way for figures like James Q. Wilson. His book, Thinking About Crime from 1975, was a major force in bringing this rational choice perspective back into the spotlight.
Wilson argued forcefully that crime isn't just because of things like poverty. It's a function of rational choice. That was a big shift.
A huge shift. He saw individuals making decisions. He suggested that those predisposed to crime might simply have less inhibition, maybe value the thrill or excitement of breaking the law more, have less invested in conventional life, less to lose.
A lower stake in conformity.
Right, and be more willing to take risks. From his viewpoint, if the probability of severe punishment could be made clear and certain, only the truly totally irrational would still commit crime.
So how do these ideas get translated into the modern version, the rational choice approach? What does that look like today?
The contemporary theory views law-violating behavior as resulting from a conscious decision-making process. An offender considers a mix of things.
Okay, like what?
Personal factors like their own need for money, maybe revenge, or just seeking thrills, and situational factors specific to the opportunity: how well protected is a target? How likely are the police to show up quickly?
This is the idea of the reasoning criminal, running a kind of mental cost-benefit analysis before acting.
That's the core. Before they act, a potential criminal evaluates the risk of getting caught, how bad the punishment might be, what they stand to gain, and maybe how pressing their immediate need is.
And the flip side, deciding not to do it.
That happens if they perceive no worthwhile economic gain, maybe, or if the risk of apprehension just feels too high in that moment.
And this perspective implies that criminals aren't necessarily fundamentally different people in terms of their goals. They just use illegal means to achieve them. The study by Philippe Bourgeois on crack dealers.
Right, the one suggesting they were motivated like average citizens wanting their piece of the pie. It's a vivid example.
It challenges the idea that criminals are somehow pathological or completely alien.
It does. This view suggests they might share conventional aspirations but see illegal paths as more accessible or perhaps more profitable, given their circumstances or skills. That story of the university lecturer supplementing her income through escort work.
Right, that's in the text.
It's another anecdote illustrating what could be seen as a perceived rational economic decision, however uncomfortable that idea might be.
The theory also makes a key distinction between offense-specific and offender-specific crime. Can we unpack those a bit?
Sure. Offense-specific means the criminal focuses on the characteristics of the particular crime they're considering.
So the details of the act itself.
Exactly. A burglar, for instance, isn't just generally looking for crime. They're evaluating a specific house. Is there likely to be cash? Can I get a getaway car easily? What's the chance of getting caught right here, right now? They react selectively to the situation.
Okay, so it's about the context of the crime event. What about offender-specific?
Offender-specific looks at the criminal individual. It recognizes that criminals aren't just automatons programmed to offend whenever there's an opportunity.
Right.
Before committing any crime, they assess their own abilities and circumstances. Do I have the skills for this? The motivation right now? The need? Am I too afraid? They might rule out criminal acts if they see legitimate ways to get what they want, or if the fear of getting caught for them in that specific situation is just too high.
That adds nuance. It's not just opportunity meeting motivation. It's about the individual assessing their own capacity and risk tolerance for that specific opportunity.
Exactly. Which leads to the distinction that crime is an event, something that happens, while criminality is more of a personal trait or readiness to offend.
So someone with the trait doesn't offend constantly.
Right. And even people without the trait might commit a crime if the circumstances are, just right or wrong, depending on your perspective. Someone deemed high risk might never offend, while an affluent person might, given a certain provocation or a unique opportunity. It's complex.
Okay. So what kinds of personal factors influence that choice towards criminality, according to the theory?
One big one is the perception of economic opportunity. If someone feels legitimate opportunities are limited, or the potential earnings from crime look high compared to legal work, well, that rational calculation shifts.
The lecture call girl anecdote fits here again.
It does. And research on hard drug users shows them sometimes increasing crime specifically for cash when they need a certain amount, making the criminal path seem perhaps the most direct or attractive option at that moment.
So if you perceive low legal income potential but high criminal earnings, crime starts to look like a rational option.
That's the argument. And interestingly, while crime often doesn't pay well for most, the source highlights that a small subset of successful criminals earning maybe, say, $50,000 a year can make the idea seem aspirational to others.
And the flip side, getting out of crime.
Desistance, yeah. It's often linked to a belief that their future criminal earnings will be low compared to available legal jobs they could get. Again, a rational choice based on their perceived economic landscape.
Another factor mentioned is learning and experience. Criminals aren't just driven by impulse, they learn over time.
Absolutely. They learn what works, what doesn't, when to take risks, and crucially, when the risks start outweighing the potential rewards. That learning process can actually lead them to stop offending, to desist. The study on female drug dealers by Morgan and Joe really illustrates this.
They learned to operate almost like a legitimate business, reportedly earning around $50 a year.
Yes, they adopted specific strategies to avoid detection, focused on product quality, managed their customers carefully. The description is almost like yuppies opening a boutique. It underlines that it's often not chaotic. It's structured learning of a criminal technique.
Which points directly to the third factor, knowledge of criminal techniques. Knowing how to avoid getting caught is a clear sign of rational, learned behavior, right?
Couldn't be clearer. Bruce Jacobs's studies of crack dealers show this really well, learning sophisticated methods like stashing drugs off-person, strategically choosing where to sell based on visibility and risk, using specific locations like alleys or spaces between buildings for riskier deals.
Gordon Knowles also found dealers using discrete locations, like pornographic film houses.
Right. And the source details specific techniques female dealers used, like consciously managing their appearance, using things like hollow earmuffs for stashing drugs, understanding legal concepts like constructive possession. These are learned, rational strategies aimed squarely at reducing risk.
So the decision to become criminal, or at least engage in criminal enterprise, is often influenced by perceived personal advantages, learning, and specific skills.
That's the idea. Now, beyond becoming criminal, they also make calculated decisions about the specific act itself, things like choosing the time, place, and target, structuring the crime event.
Okay, walk us through that. How do they structure the crime?
Well, first, they might choose the type of crime. Some specialized car thieves stick to cars. Others might generalize or shift based on perceived market opportunities.
Like robbing the elderly on the first of the month.
Exactly, because that's when Social Security checks often arrive. A grim example, but it shows rational targeting based on known cash flow. Eric Baumer's research linking crack cocaine availability to increased robbery but decreased burglary is another example.
Why that shift?
The thinking is crack users need quick cash. Robbery provides that faster than planning and executing a burglary and then fencing the goods. It's a rational adaptation to the immediate demands of their situation or habit.
Makes a disturbing kind of sense. What about choosing the time and place?
There's strong evidence of rationality here. Burglars often prefer times when homes are likely empty mid-morning or mid-afternoon weekdays, maybe even Sunday mornings during church services.
Targeting families with star athletes during game time is pretty specific. That requires observation.
It shows they're paying attention to routine activities and exploiting predictable windows of opportunity. For location, they often avoid heavily traveled streets, but might maybe counterintuitively, like corner homes near stop signs, because stopping there looks normal.
Interesting.
They also favor secluded homes or those in what are called permeable neighborhoods, places with lots of access and escape routes. Convenience, familiarity, and perceived safety are key.
Do they travel far?
Usually not. They tend to stick close to their own neighborhoods, familiar terrain, easier assessment. But they might travel for a particularly high-value target, or if they need to avoid a police crackdown in their usual area, if the heat is on.
They're aware of police presence.
Very much so.
Yeah.
They're assessing law enforcement capability, rationally avoiding areas they perceive as aggressive and seeking out passive ones. Finally, they rationally choose the target based on vulnerability.
How so?
People involved in deviant behavior themselves might be seen as safer targets because they're less likely to call the police the dirty hands idea.
Yeah.
And crucially, avoiding victims perceived as armed or dangerous. The Wright and Rossi study found felons feared armed victims more than police. This rational avoidance might even explain lower unarmed robbery rates in cities with high gun carriage rates.
Tunnel's study showed burglars avoiding places with obvious police presence or even just nosy neighbors.
Exactly. It all points to calculation. So while the initial decision to offend might involve complex personal factors, the execution of the crime itself often seems marked by a series of calculated choices to maximize gain and minimize risk.
We've seen a lot of evidence suggesting rationality in economic crimes, things like theft and burglary. But the big question is all crime truly rational?
Yeah.
What about seemingly impulsive acts or violent ones?
That's definitely where the debate gets hotter. Even common theft, like maybe shoplifting or a quick, unplanned-looking burglary, can involve rapid risk assessments. Are there cameras? Where's the staff?
And professional shoplifters, boosters, and fences certainly use sophisticated, rational methods.
Absolutely. And burglars employ skills and knowledge, checking if a house is empty, looking for unlocked doors, actively avoiding dogs, choosing neighborhoods that offer easy access and escape. It's not usually random.
The point is made that planned burglary declined in Britain, partly because goods like DVD players became so cheap they were uh, barely worth nicking. That's a market-driven rational calculation influencing crime trends.
A really clear example of economics influencing the criminal calculus. Okay, what about drug use? It might seem inherently irrational, almost the opposite of rational choice.
Yeah, how could using harmful drugs be seen as rational?
Well, the argument is that even drug users and dealers make rational choices, at least in part. From the very beginning, choosing to try drugs often involves weighing perceived benefits like fun, fitting in, or thrill against known costs, often influenced heavily by peers or family environment.
Okay, maybe initially, but addiction.
Even with addiction, for adult users and especially dealers, it often becomes much more strategic. It can be approached almost like a business. We talked about the studies on female dealers using business terms like recon and approaching the trade in an organized way.
The text mentions Hector Vega, portraying drug dealing as a business with rules and roles, not just spontaneous acts of rage or desperation.
Yes, it challenges the idea that it's always impulsive or purely due to illness. It poses that critical thinking question: is it a business, or are people forced into it? Can it truly be analogous to legitimate business? It's a complex issue.
Okay, then what about violence? Often there's little material gain. Is violence rational? That feels like the hardest case to make.
It does seem counterintuitive, yet the theory finds elements of rationality even here. Robbers, as we said, choose vulnerable victims, specific times like the busy Christmas season or locations within their familiar awareness space for quicker escape.
And they avoid armed victims.
Right, which suggests a rational assessment of risk. Even seemingly non-instrumental violence can have conscious motives carrying weapons for self-protection, especially in dangerous environments like drug dealing, seeking revenge for specific disputes, or, chillingly, killing witnesses to avoid retaliation or getting caught.
Rational killers. It challenges our usual understanding.
Serial murderers, for example, often pick their targets with extreme care, avoiding powerful groups in favor of more vulnerable, accessible ones. Serial rapists sometimes travel significant distances specifically to avoid recognition. These acts, while horrific, can involve reasoned steps towards achieving the offender's goal, whether that's gain, control, revenge, or simply maximizing their perceived safety or success during the act.
So even in the most disturbing violent acts, there can be calculated choices about the target, time, and method. This links to the concept of edge work, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Edge work describes that exhilarating, momentary integration of danger, risk, and skill. It suggests that engaging in dangerous behaviors, criminal or even non-criminal, like extreme sports, can be motivated by the sheer pleasure and excitement that comes from navigating risk itself.
So crime isn't just irrational or driven by desperation.
In this view, no. It can offer pleasure, a sense of accomplishment, or a solution, however deviant, for the offender. It adds another layer to the why.
Okay, if criminals are making these calculations, even in surprising ways, how has rational choice theory been translated into concrete public policy and crime control strategies?
Yeah.
This seems like the logical next step.
It's had a huge influence, really. Policies rooted in this thinking aim to manipulate that cost-benefit analysis we keep talking about, basically making crime harder, riskier, or less rewarding.
And the primary strategy here is Situational Crime Prevention, or SCP.
Exactly. SCP is all about convincing potential offenders to avoid specific targets or locations by making them less suitable, less attractive for crime. Its roots are in ideas like Oscar Newman's defensible space.
Using architectural design to increase visibility.
Right, natural surveillance. And C. Ray Jeffries' CPDED, crime prevention through environmental design, applying these principles more broadly even to non-residential areas.
So we're talking about things like security systems, better locks, improved street lighting, encouraging neighborhood watch programs, tangible changes.
Exactly. These are mechanisms designed to increase the effort or perceived risk associated with a specific location or target. The core idea is reducing criminal opportunities by altering the immediate environment. This approach led to cataloging various techniques, often grouped by how they influence the offender's calculation.
Like increasing the perceived effort needed or increasing the perceived risk of getting caught.
Precisely. Increasing effort could be as simple as adding steering locks to cars, which did help reduce car theft, or using ignition interlock devices for convicted drunk drivers. You make the act itself physically harder.
And increasing risk.
That might involve visible surveillance cameras, CCTV, entry and exit screening like at airports, or just having more employees visible, like park attendants.
This brings up the concept of crime discourages people whose presence increases risk.
Yeah, Marcus Felson's concept. Guardians who monitor targets, handlers who monitor potential offenders, and managers who monitor places. The more effective these are, the higher the perceived risk.
The CCTV debate comes up here too, doesn't it? Popular in the UK, maybe less so in the US?
Right. There's often more pushback in the U.S. due to Fourth Amendment privacy concerns, although that shifted somewhat after 9/11. It raises that fascinating question for everyone. Would you be willing to have cameras watching public or even semi-private spaces if it significantly cut crime? It highlights the trade-offs.
Definitely a tough balance. What about reducing the potential payoff of the crime?
That's the third category. Reducing anticipated rewards. This could mean making targets less valuable in the first place, like removable car radios became popular for a while, or making stolen property identifiable through marking programs, or denying the immediate benefit, like those ink tags on clothing that ruin the item is stolen. Make the benefit part of the cost-benefit analysis smaller.
And the fourth category mentioned is inducing guilt or shame. How does that work?
This involves strategies that make the social costs clearer, tapping into informal controls. Examples include enforcing rules against harassment or strengthening moral condemnation through public campaigns like shoplifting is stealing.
The source mentions John lists for soliciting prostitutes.
Right, leveraging the fear of public exposure and social shame as a deterrent. Caller ID technology, reducing obscene calls, is another example. Shame can be a powerful motivator.
Interestingly, the source also mentions potential unintended positive side effects of SCP, like diffusion and discouragement. What are those?
Diffusion is when crime control efforts in one specific area spill over and reduce crime in nearby areas too, maybe because offenders perceive the whole zone as riskier. Discouragement is when targeting one specific crime type inadvertently reduces other types of crime as well.
Can you give an example?
The SMART program targeting drug dealing in Oakland is cited for diffusion crime decreased in adjacent areas too. And LoJack, the car tracking system, is an example of discouragement. It disrupted the stolen auto parts market generally, making chop shops wary of buying any potentially tracked vehicle, thus reducing other types of car theft.
So SCP focuses on the specific opportunities and immediate environment. A related but broader strategy is general deterrence. This is more about the overall threat of punishment in society.
Exactly. General deterrence relies on controlling crime rates by creating the threat of punishment for everyone. The theory predicts an inverse relationship. The higher the severity, certainty, and speed of legal sanctions, the lower the crime rate should be, theoretically.
And certainty seems to be the most emphasized element. Thinking you will get caught matters most.
That's a key insight from research. The idea is that deterrence only really kicks in when the certainty of punishment reaches a critical tipping point, maybe estimated around a 30% chance of arrest for serious crimes. Crime persists partly because many criminals perceive the likelihood of getting caught and punished as actually pretty low.
This is where debates about increasing police activity come in. The famous Kansas City experiment found little impact from just adding patrols.
Right, that was a landmark study suggesting random patrols weren't that effective. But more recent research, using different methods and looking at targeted patrols, has suggested that increasing police presence can lead to significant crime reductions. It's complicated to measure.
What about crackdowns, sudden increases in police activity?
Research suggests they can cause initial deterrence, a short-term drop. But the effect often wears off pretty quickly unless they're sustained or combined with other strategies, perhaps because criminals figure the intense focus won't last.
Okay, what about severity? Does making punishments harsher really reduce crime rates overall?
The evidence here is quite mixed, honestly. Some data has shown a link between the probability of imprisonment and declines in violent crime rates. But other studies, like analyses of drunk driving laws across different places, don't find that clear, consistent connection between sentence length and deterrence.
So it's not a slam dunk.
Not at all. Some research suggests some types of people are more responsive to severity, they're more deterrable, but it's definitely not a universally accepted deterrent across the board for everyone.
The ultimate debate on severity, of course, involves capital punishment. Does the death penalty deter murder?
That's probably the most contentious area. The traditional view in criminology has been that it has little impact, arguing murder is often an impulsive crime of passion, less influenced by rational fear of future punishment.
But that's being challenged.
Yes, some more recent, sophisticated statistical studies have found some association, suggesting a possible deterrent effect, or perhaps that maybe the use of capital punishment has reached a level in some places where a tipping point for deterrence might be occurring. but it's incredibly debated, both empirically and morally.
And there's even the argument, mentioned in the source, that it could make things more dangerous for police if criminals facing execution resist arrest more violently.
That adds another layer of complexity to the rational calculation for everyone involved, including the police. Now, beyond formal legal sanctions, the theory also considers informal sanctions.
Like the fear of disappointing or being shamed by friends, family, or the community. Social costs.
Exactly. And research strongly suggests these informal controls can be powerful deterrents, perhaps even more effective than the fear of legal punishment alone, or at least working best in combination with it.
Fear of shame seems key.
Yes, the fear of shame, both personal guilt and public humiliation, is highlighted as particularly potent. This is why anti-crime campaigns sometimes use public shaming elements. Studies on spouse abusers, for instance, found they often feared the social costs, losing family, reputation, more than the legal punishment.
Given all this, why does general deterrence sometimes fail? If criminals are rational, why do they still offend when punishment exists? It seems like it should work better.
That's the million-dollar question. There are several proposed reasons. First, the assumption of a fully rational offender is a big one. Many offenders have impaired judgment due to, say, personality disorders or the influence of drugs or alcohol at the time, making rational calculation difficult.
So they're not always calculating clearly.
Right. Need is another factor for individuals facing extreme poverty or lacking legitimate options. The perceived gain from crime might simply outweigh the perceived risk, especially if they feel they have little stake in conventional life or see others getting away with crime.
Calculation errors are also mentioned, just misjudging the risk.
Yes. Offenders might simply underestimate the likelihood of getting caught or the severity of the likely punishment, or they might just be impulsive. And the realities of the criminal justice system itself undermine deterrence.
How so?
The system is often inefficient. The actual probability of apprehension for many crimes is low. And even if someone is arrested, the chances of receiving a truly severe punishment decrease as cases move through the courts due to plea bargaining, sentencing variations, etc. This low perceived certainty and speed significantly weakens the deterrent power of the law.
So general deterrence tries to stop people from starting crime. What about specific deterrence? This focuses on preventing known offenders, people already caught, from committing future crimes by punishing them severely.
That's the idea. The logic is that experiencing painful punishment will create such bad memories that it deters that individual from future criminal acts.
But the evidence here is quite problematic for the theory, isn't it?
It really is, because, as the source points out, the majority of known criminals do recidivate. They commit more crimes after being punished.
So punishment doesn't seem to stop them.
Often it doesn't. And some research even suggests that arrest and punishment, particularly for first-time or juvenile offenders, might sometimes increase future crime.
How could that happen?
By exposing them to the criminal justice system, labeling them, maybe teaching them criminal skills in prison, or by creating a stigma that makes legitimate life harder and locks them into a criminal identity. Most prison inmates have prior records and high recidivism rates within just a few years of release, suggesting past punishment didn't specifically deter them.
Harsh punishment might also just breed defiance rather than compliance.
That's another possibility. Or the lightning never strikes twice. ID offenders think they got caught the first time, but they'll be smarter or luckier next time. That perception undermines specific deterrence.
Are there any studies supporting specific deterrence?
Well, some studies find that arrest or conviction can lower reoffending under certain circumstances for certain people. And perhaps only the most severe punishments have some influence on experienced criminals. But it's far from a consistent or strong finding overall. The deterring domestic violence research is a classic example of this messiness.
Ah, yes. The Minneapolis study suggested arrest was effective, leading to mandatory arrest policies in many places.
Right, that initial study was hugely influential, but replication studies in other cities often found the effect was much more modest, decayed quickly, and in some cases could even escalate violence long-term, particularly for offenders who were unemployed.
Why such mixed results?
Several reasons are suggested. Fear of arrest might wear off if the follow-up punishment isn't seen as severe. Repeat offenders might not fear arrest if they learn police are often reluctant to make an arrest unless there's visible injury. And past experience might simply make the perceived severity of the system less daunting than anticipated. It suggests maybe treatment or counseling, if taken seriously, could be more effective than just arrest.
And this connects back to labeling theory, the idea that the stigma of arrest or conviction can damage a person's identity and push them further into antisocial behavior.
Exactly. The unintended consequences of punishment can really work against its intended specific deterrent effect.
Okay, so general and specific deterrents have mixed track records. The final major strategy derived from choice theory is incapacitation. This seems more straightforward.
Incapacitation is simple in its logic. Reduce crime by physically removing motivated offenders from the community through incarceration. If they're locked up, they can't commit crimes against the public. Pure and simple removal.
And proponents point to the fact that prison populations grew significantly over the past few decades, and that coincided with a decline in crime rates since the 1990s. They see a connection.
That correlation is a key argument used to support incapacitation. Data showing the high number of crimes that estimates suggest incarcerated individuals would likely commit if they were free also supports the idea.
But the arguments against incapacitation seem pretty substantial too, based on the source material.
They are. Research on its direct impact on crime rates is actually inconclusive. Some studies suggest even large changes in prison populations might only have a fairly modest effect on overall crime rates. It's hard to disentangle the effect of incapacitation from general deterrence or other social and economic factors that were changing at the same time.
And prison itself isn't always just a neutral holding pen. It can expose offenders to more experienced criminals, worsen health problems, and potentially increase their likelihood of offending upon release.
Right. There's also the economic argument. If there's a market for crime, like drug dealing, new criminals might simply replace the incarcerated ones, offsetting the incapacitation effect. Plus, much street crime is committed by younger offenders who tend to get shorter sentences anyway.
And locking up older inmates.
They're often already aging out of their peak offending years anyway, so locking them up for very long periods might have less impact on current crime rates while being incredibly expensive. The cost is enormous.
Which brings up the idea of selective incapacitation, trying to be smarter about it.
Yes, trying to identify and lock up only the chronic, high-rate career criminals for longer periods based on predicting their future offending. Early studies, like one from the RAND Corporation, suggested this could potentially reduce serious crime like robbery while maybe even reducing the total prison population.
This principle is behind policies like three strikes laws, mandatory life sentences for a third violent felony.
Exactly. But these laws are very controversial. Critics argue they often punish offenders who are already aging out of crime, that existing sentences are often already severe, they dramatically increase costs, especially long-term health care for inmates, can lead to racial disparities in sentencing, and might even make criminals more dangerous as they violently resist arrest knowing the severe consequences of a third strike.
Plus, the highest frequency offenders might already be in prison under existing laws.
That's another argument. But supporters do credit policies like three strikes, with contributing to significant crime rate drops in places like California. Again, causation is hard to prove definitively.
And even in California, the source notes, three strikes has lost some popularity due to concerns about it being maybe too harsh or too costly.
It reflects the ongoing debate about the effectiveness and fairness of these incapacitation strategies.
So, rational choice theory, despite all the debates about the true rationality of crime and the effectiveness of the policies, has profoundly influenced public policy, shaping how we design laws, implement mandatory sentences, and focus our correctional system on incapacitation and specific deterrence.
Absolutely. It's undeniably shifted the focus, particularly in the U.S., back towards punishment, opportunity reduction, and risk management. This brings us finally to the principle of just desert.
Which argues that punishment should be proportional to the crime committed, focusing on fairness.
Right. The just desert principle emphasizes that those who violate others' rights deserve punishment, and that punishment should fit the seriousness of the crime, not just be a means to an end like deterrence or incapacitation. It's about justice and proportionality.
How does that fit with deterrence?
It can sometimes conflict. It raises a fundamental question. Is it fair to punish two crimes of similar seriousness differently, just because one type of offender might be easier to deter with a harsh sentence? Just desert injects ideas of fairness and deservedness into what could otherwise be a purely utilitarian, deterrence-focused approach.
We've covered a huge amount of ground, from the historical roots in Beccaria and Bentham, the core ideas of criminals as reasoning individuals weighing costs and benefits, to the specific ways they might structure criminality in crime events, the debates about rationality in different crime types, and finally the major policy implications like situational prevention, deterrence, and incapacitation.
It's clear this theory, this way of thinking about crime as a choice, has shaped criminology and criminal justice significantly. But as we've seen throughout, the empirical evidence supporting the effectiveness of some of the derived policies is often mixed, debated, or context dependent.
It suggests that while the idea of a rational choice certainly plays a role, the reality of criminal decision-making is probably far more complex.
Definitely. It's influenced by a host of factors beyond just a simple cost-benefit analysis. Emotions, opportunities, social contexts, individual differences. And the criminal justice system itself is far from a perfectly efficient machine for delivering that swift, certain, severe punishment the classical theorists envisioned.
So what does this all mean for you, thinking about how we can best prevent crime? We've learned that simply making punishments harsher or locking more people up isn't the guaranteed solution the pure theory might initially imply, and that the idea of crime as a purely rational act has its clear limitations.
Yeah, so perhaps the final thought to leave you with is this. Given the complexities and the very mixed evidence around deterring crime, mainly through increasing punishment, severity, and certainty, how might a focus on addressing the perceived lack of legitimate economic opportunity, or maybe leveraging those informal social controls, community ties, shame, social support, how might that change our approach to crime prevention?
Hmm.
It challenges us to think beyond just the formal legal system and consider how strengthening communities and providing viable alternatives might reshape that rational calculus before someone even gets to the point of considering a criminal act.
A fascinating thought to leave with. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into choice theories in criminology.